For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. Happy Friday, Brian. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. How about yourself?
Good, thanks. You know, I think that we decided to kick this discussion off on the topic of NPS, is it dead? Which is, shamelessly clickbaity. And I'm always reminded of, was it Mark Twain who said, tales of my death are greatly exaggerated,
right.
Or at least it was something that Mark Twain was attributed to.
Right.
I went looking online to see if I could find anything that was new and innovative on this topic. And perhaps not surprisingly, you have to sort of wade through the morass of vendors who have something different to sell you. And so NPS is dead is always followed by, and we have this new and improved thing that by the way, you can just operate as a standing by, call us right now, and we'll be happy to sell it to you. I did find something that I thought was widely quoted, generally out of context, which was a Gartner study, albeit from 2021. Gartner predicts more than 75% of organizations will abandon NPS as a measure by 2025. Now, that was the headline people enjoyed. Actually, what Gartner said was and by the way, we're now in 2025, so it'd be interesting to see whether they stand by their prediction. More than 75% of companies will abandon NPS as a measure of customer service by 2025, which actually changes that definition somewhat substantially because I think we'd argue, right? I'd love your opinion on this. Why would you be using NPS as a measure of customer service anyway?
Yeah, I think that's a little upside down when you think about it. I think you should think about customer service as an element that might feed a metric like NPS. And I think, we've been in practice with lots of customers doing actual programs for many, many years now. And so I tend to think a little differently than pundits who are kind of speaking from the mountaintop on this stuff. I can tell you what I see in the field where I run our teams is that, NPS is perennially dead or dying and perennially there forever. It's sort of a conversation you're just having, I think, in the abstract. But what I really see is the practical use of a metric like Net Promoter Score is still very much alive. It's just really sitting inside of a very transformed paradigm to where it was several years back when it was, you had an NPS auditor running a program once a year and coming back and telling everybody, here's what the slide deck says about your NPS score. I think still remains a useful metric. I think it's really the NPS program that is transformed. It is the NPS program team that I think is, for lack of a better term, highly at risk in today's world. If it's not shifting to the new paradigm, I think that's where we start to see signs of death.
Yeah, so it's, I think that going back to the earliest years of NPS, a lot of the criticism, I think, was somewhat misplaced because it was actually criticism of the lack of diagnostics, which NPS never alluded to be a diagnostic. And nobody suggested that you shouldn't do diagnostics alongside NPS. So we had that kind of wave of, it's a bad idea because of that. Mm-hmm. We had some more useful insights when Fred Reichheld and Rob Markey published, I think it was Net Promoter 2.0 or the Ultimate Question 2.0. And they had a data point, and we can share it with the audience, that I thought was actually sort of went right under the radar for most people. And certainly the NPS is dead crowd kind of skipped right past it completely. And it was basically making the point that survey-based NPS was actually pretty biased towards positive results. And so if you think about the application of the metric using traditional methods, you had surveys being done, as you said, sort of on an annual basis, which feels just incredibly dated. It feels like we're back to the, we're going back 10, 15 years when people talk about relationship data surveys. You had NPS being used in contact centers, which, pursuant to Gartner's observation, was never a good use for it in the first place. And so Gartner standing up and saying, 75% of people will stop doing this stupid thing they shouldn't have done in the first place. That's brilliant insight. Right. And then you had Bain coming out with a more thoughtful piece saying, actually there's inherent bias associated with this sort of workhorse, the survey. And we're now getting data, or we certainly are speculating that we've been looking at this the wrong way anyway. And doesn't that feed into your case that says the traditional program is just about run its course?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, we're out there. So what we're doing with customers today, we would call generative CX analytics. So we're sort of, instead of taking that notion that we're going to limit ourselves to doing all of our analytics on the sample we collect in a survey, we take the survey and we train AI to actually give you deeper, more complete and comprehensive metrics across all your customers, continuously updating those, right? And so what we see when we compare those two worlds, where the customer is looking at an NPS score that's survey derived versus what we see when we score all of the customer base, it almost invariably is undercounting dramatically detractors in the model. And that's what Fred and Mark said in 2.0, is that they saw anecdotally, before we could do this kind of work, they would see that this was very much the case. And so I think those are the kinds of things that when the NPS crowd, the NPS is dead crowd, sort of chimes in, they're pointing to those flaws in the approach of the program. The metric, I mean, think about what the metric really is. It's saying what percentage of my customers are really recommenders or referral candidates for me versus the other. It's a good, healthy score. I think it's got a high bar. In many ways, it's better than a SAT score when you're trying to conceive of the state of the customer. But look, I see lots of sort of past paradigms falling by the wayside beyond NPS. Everywhere I go, there's somebody complaining about the inaccuracies of some kind of concocted health score that they've created in a customer success organization that always promised to be data driven but usually isn't. So what I think the real paradigm shift is coming to is it's not about the metric, it's about the production of the metric and the use of the metric and how those things are changing, Richard. I think we're in a data driven world today. If your program is not a data driven, always on, continuous program, then I think you are in kind of dinosaur land. You're sort of at risk for being irrelevant.
I mean, it feels like the idea was the best idea anyone had given the alternatives circa 20 years ago, and it was very effective at getting everyone's attention. It just feels out of date. If I was to accuse of it, I wouldn't say it's dead. I'd just say it's old. Maybe it's in old age. It hasn't died yet, but to some extent, it's looking long in the tooth. And that's because of its association at the end of the day with survey technology. And survey technology is sort of the buggy whip of the CX world. It was a great story 20 years ago. I read this other piece. Someone had and they actually had a tombstone in this, and I'll put this up on the screen for people looking on the video. And again, the tombstone's very dramatic. Net Promoter Score is no better than the beauty contest. Well, I think I can understand, given that you and I are doing this podcast, how people could easily draw the conclusion it's all about a beauty contest.
It's all about, it's a pure vanity play for me.
But buried in the clickbaity part of this was a comment that said, expecting NPS alone can predict churn is wrong. Now, one of the things that we had determined largely through data, which, perhaps step back for a second. I mean, let's recall that going right back to the start of this, the fundamental reason that executives bought into NPS was linkage to business growth and performance, right? This is why it took off. And, it wasn't because it was an elegantly constructed metric or was well written or it was simple to execute. I think those are things that were secondary. But the reason companies took off was because there was this linkage and correlation to overall growth rates in businesses, largely B2C analysis. And Bain recently presented some more data that suggests, I think from their PRISM benchmark, suggesting that NPS leaders continue to outperform in terms of value creation in their industry. So there's still this drumbeat of data that says, hey, if you have a really high NPS, you're doing better than everyone else. And that's not necessarily causal, but it's happening. And this author suggests, well, hold on a second, on its own, it's not useful at predicting churn. And I had probably 10, 15 years ago scoffed at that, but now I'm not so sure. Isn't it increasingly looking like churn and financial metrics have a odd relationship with NPS. I mean, from the analysis we've done, it seems like that's not as linear as we'd all like it to be. It's a little more complicated. I know you got thoughts on this. What do you see in terms of that connection between business outcomes and NPS as a metric?
Yeah, I think, the idea of an NPS score being valid because it represents a harbinger of future business outcome, I feel like that's largely undisturbed. I think you can see that connection longer over time. I think it is a little more tenuous in the area of churn in our experience. It's actually a little bit more correlated to growth and expansion than it might be to downside churn. And I think the real truth of NPS is that it's functioning as a very difficult to get data set that represents the outside in perspective on your business. And that's why CEOs value it so much, is they understand that I think that there's a real risk of getting myopic about your own operational metrics, being forecasters of what you're going to do. We know we need those, but they in and of themselves aren't enough. If I could explain customers' behavior or attitude simply by looking at the operational metrics, there'd be no need for any kind of program like this. If I could explain them, by the way, only through a survey and an NPS score, there'd be no need for a program like this. The real art of this is putting these things together. And it's really the idea of how I can connect those dots so that I can understand what correlations exist between the things I'm measuring and that I'm managing and the outcome attitudes with customers. And so I think that that's the way the world looks when you're sort of putting these things into practice. I think the other thing we've learned, Richard, is that there's an art to think of it as asking the right question at the right time, right? So to ask an NPS or would you recommend me question from a recently won customer who's still really activating through your process, I mean, why wouldn't they recommend you? It'd be a giant bit of cognitive dissonance to say, I just spent a lot of money on this and I'm working really hard on this. And I wouldn't recommend it. Right? Yeah,
you're in big trouble.
You're in big trouble if that's the case. Whereas I think in the middle of, let's say, a 3-year contract, and you're trying to understand the perception of your customer, I think NPS is a great question. It's really a reflection of how much value realization are they feeling? Is it enough to really refer you? But then as you move downstream and you start to move into a world where you're really back into the consideration phase as you're renewing a contract or repurchasing, then I think NPS is not the right question. I think you really need to start to lean on things like propensity, because you're not really just asking about the value equation. You're really trying to figure out what their behavior will be. And there are better mechanisms. I think we use propensity modeling for that a lot. And I think that's a different kind of signal, and it's more appropriate at that point in the life cycle. Well,
and in B2B, I mean, it's true in consumer markets as well, but it's very pronounced to B2B. There's a lot of complexity to contracting, right? And the idea that if you're signed a 3-year contract with a customer, the correlation between NPS and retention in the first 12 months is not going to be very correlated. The customer's not going anywhere, right? They can be really unhappy. They're not going to leave. Now, you could say they're hostaged. But all that tells us is that, yes, this is not quite as simple as a linear relationship. Unhappy customers leave, happy customers stay or expand. There's really 2 parallel universes here. There's looking at everything through the lens of risk and opportunity, and there's looking at it through the lens of loyalty. And loyalty has a bearing on this. I think one of the problems churn modelers fall short of too often is they tune out completely the customer perspective. So they'll look at correlating variables in churn models, and whether or not the customer is delighted or dissatisfied doesn't even show up in their model. And so they're basically saying that's completely irrelevant. Customers' attitudes just don't matter. Well, that's too extreme as well. I mean, there's no way that your attitude doesn't have some bearing. I think the question you're raising is, what point in the cycle does it have a bearing? How much of a bearing does it have? How do you put that alongside churn metrics?
Right. I think there are inadequacies in all of these piece parts trying to operate alone. So if I think about maybe the kind of traditional ways businesses operate today, where they're looking into their own data, they're trying to create key performance indicators or OKRs, and they're trying to use that to understand the health of their business. That also has its blind spots, right? If if we've learned anything from the past several Nobel Prizes in economics, is that behavioral economics is teaching us that there is a relatively irrational kind of way in which people form attitudes and base their behaviors. And I think what the NPS side or the CX side of the equation, where we're really literally trying to get natural language responses, human responses into the model, they're really trying to account for the mindset of the customer, which is not going to be purely an outcome of your metrics, right? So it's the complementary nature that makes all of this stuff go forward. And I think where we find the most, that where programs are the most behind is when they're too one dimensional. They're either all about their KPIs and they think those tell them everything that's going to happen, or they're all about an annual survey that's kind of functioning as a market research study. Maybe in some cases it is a beauty contest kind of vanity metric. I think what's hard, but what's most fruitful, is to try to combine those signals in a way that you can then test and validate. Look, none of this is valid to me unless I can see what kinds of scores I'm giving people and see it bear out in reality over time. And I think all of our customers, all of the people in the marketplace today are looking for that outcome. They're no longer willing to take it on faith.
Yeah, it's when we started Net Promoter Certification, it was 2008. The biggest educational challenge we had with people was separating transactions from relationships, right? There was this constant confusion around measuring NPS at a transactional touch point. This really talks to the non-news item that Gartner published. In some ways it was like, yeah, incredible observation. This is a terrible idea 15 years ago. It's still a terrible idea. There was a lot of confusion around that. Now you fast forward to today, and I wonder whether programs are starting to fail for different reasons. They might have cracked those problems back in the day. They might have figured out good practice, but they've lost all sort of momentum or currency within the company. And so reframing the question, is NPS dead? Better question is your NPS program dead?
Right.
And the currency's disappeared in the business, not because executives don't care about customer experience. I don't think it's because they've decided NPS wasn't a useful metric. I think all of those are red herrings. I think the ugly reality for most CX professionals is they've failed to deliver data that is of high value to the enterprise, that informs better decision making.
Yeah.
And that's in part because they've stuck with a paradigm that became obsolete some time ago, as we're discussing, or they've recast themselves as less about CX programs and more about being survey programs. In some ways, they've defined themselves by the tool they use, as opposed to defining themselves by what they're trying to accomplish. And so the result is that tools and technologies have moved on, the world has progressed, but CX teams are kind of stuck in the past. And if your core competence is, well, I can write a great survey, and that's somewhat questionable, I'd argue, in terms of good survey design, and all of a sudden you get a whole new set of technologies arrive, and the most recent, most impactful being artificial intelligence, you're basically, you're stapling yourself to a technology set that's looking increasingly obsolete. And there's the obvious maxim that everyone points about Henry Ford and faster horses. I think that we all like to quote that one, but I think what people overlook is that what Henry Ford didn't have at the time, when he talked about people wanted faster horses instead of cars, is that there weren't legions of horse salespeople going around selling faster horses. I mean, if you're a CX program person, you are deluged by survey vendors explaining how they've come up with some new wrinkle in surveying, and it's going to have some, marginal, the absolute margin benefit associated with the response rate, perhaps. Meanwhile, your ship's sinking, right? I mean, you're literally losing data accuracy, losing data currency at an incredibly astonishing rate. And you need to essentially abandon the fact that you're going to be able to finesse this using a slightly faster horse.
I think it's also there are many of these programs, and I think if you're listening to this and you're running a traditional program and you're asking what the path forward is I think the good news is there's an excellent path forward. The data that you're collecting is marginal and probably a hygiene metric if you're sort of sitting in the corner pumping out that once a year survey or a couple of transactionals. You're going to have to recognize that your leadership and your operators are seeing that as a movie they see once a year, right? It's a brief thing they look at once a year. But you're creating an incredibly valuable data set if it's purposed in the right way. And I think what AI has come along and done is it's shown a way. It's given us a path to take an existing set of survey data that we may be collecting today. We may have to tune our systems a little better to produce the right data, but it's really important data. And then I think the other thing that's sitting over there is this accumulated mountain of operational data called big data that's been growing up around the ears of enterprises, and they don't know what to do with it. When you put these things together, there's a really exciting future for CX plans. You can really start to become an operational system. Back when I first started as the chief product officer at a company called YouSendIt, we had a lot of data accumulating in our system around web traffic, product traffic. Most of that we'd have to dive into logs, do analysis. It became a once in a while analytics exercise. But what we've found is through things like Splunk to tell me what's going on in my data center and things like Google Analytics to be always on and tell me what's going on in my web properties, people won't live with that anymore. They're not looking for episodic, torturous projects. You have an opportunity, I think, to really sort of reorient the program and your very rare expertise in CX toward this very new outcome. And the ones that are doing that, I think, are at unprecedented levels of relevance in the business.
Yeah.
And so I think the good news is there's a bright light on the other side of this, but you do, I think, have to start thinking about transforming the program. I do see a lot of them today that aren't.
Well, we're going to see the classic adoption curve, right? So I'll date myself. When we started in this business, people were telling me that people would move to emails because phone was the only way anyone would respond to data collection, right? And I'd imagine that probably 10, 15 years earlier, someone was saying, no, we need someone with a clipboard on the street. There's always been this sort of arc of adoption of new technologies. There's been leaders and laggards.
Yeah.
And we know that most of the benefits accrue to the people who get in front of that. I mean, there's a certain element of risk taking because you're pioneering. And, I think these applications are new and they're different. And in such, you're pioneering the use of these technologies. But I think the alternative, which is sticking with something that's clearly obsolete, is a heck of a lot worse. So I wonder if we started with this asking question, is NPS dead? We kind of moved on to the idea that tales of its death are greatly exaggerated, but NPS programs are looking pretty long in the tooth, should we say? And you wouldn't fancy being a program manager for a traditional CX program these days if the company runs into budgetary pressure.
I think if you would have said the same quote you gave from Gartner about NPS being dead, if that had said the traditional NPS program, I'd say there's a lot of evidence that a lot of that has occurred by today. And there's
I'm sure Gartner or Forrester probably predicted that 10 years ago. You say economists predicted, 5 out of the last 3 recessions correctly. I think that, the prediction business it's easy to get a headline saying something's dying. I think the more interesting prediction would have been to see how these programs are going to evolve. And I think 5 years from now, what we're going to look back on is the fact that all the results, the gap between the early adopters of the next generation technology versus the traditional is going to be massive. Same way that it was 20 years ago when people moved off phone-based data collection to email or moved on to NPS from unbelievably complicated composite metrics. So I think that, wrap this up and say if the traditional program is dead or at very least on its last legs, is the mandate for people running these programs, I would make the argument that the first thing they need to do is to redefine the objectives of these programs in the minds of their own leadership. If they can't get management excited about the potential of these programs.
Yeah.
And I think the risk, and I've seen this happen many companies, is there's almost this standoff now between line management and CX professionals, where line management's expectations have essentially been lowered to the point where they don't care anymore. The CX program exists in the corner. They don't really care much about it. They don't want to kill it because it's kind of embarrassing to say we don't care anymore. But they don't expect much from it. And, if the CX team shows up once a year, does a presentation, everyone politely claps, they leave. They don't get any. Anything particularly useful out of it.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, the result is that the expectations are exceptionally low, and the CX team doesn't stretch themselves to do anything better because at the end of the day, there are low expectations.
Well, I think maybe what would be so I actually think there, as I said earlier, I think there's a path, and I think there's some really important keys to getting on that path. Maybe next time we talk, we could come back and talk a little bit about what's the roadmap, what are the ways in which to move to that new CX paradigm in another conversation, maybe give some people the benefit of what we've seen successful programs who are making these moves and successful practitioners who are making these choices, what they need to do. I think there are some really great success stories, and I think the future is really bright. I think there's going to be, it is an existential moment. You're either going to survive this and come out the other end being much more relevant and important in the business, or you're going to die a slow death of attrition in a corner as an NPS auditor. And I'd hate to see that happen to folks.
All right, good topic for next time. We'll pick that up when we talk next. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.